So, to begin, if you could just state your name and then begin by discussing a bit what you did in NASA and any other relevant information.
All right. Well, my name is Morton Jorgensen, but everybody calls me Mort. Morton is a little bit heavy. Uh, I'm a doctor of medicine by trade. At the time of the involvement with NASA, I was in the Navy. So I was a naval medical officer, commander in rank at the time. And I was working down at the Navy Hospital here in San Diego. And I had the vascular surgical service as my primary job there at the Navy Hospital. It was one of those quiet afternoons. All of a sudden the phone rang, and there was my boss, Captain Bob Lanning, chief of surgery, on the phone, and he said, "Jurgy," which is what he called me, "be at the Cape next Thursday at 0800. Your orders are on my secretary's desk." So I picked up the orders and off I went by airplane to Orlando and then down to the Cape. And what it turned out to be was a briefing for the Apollo program for the medical support of it. And in this case, the significant one was the Apollo 8 mission. And they wanted a surgical team on board the carrier, the recovery carrier, which in this case was the USS Yorktown, CVS number 10. It was an old World War II type aircraft carrier that had been modernized and was being used for this particular mission. At the Cape, we got a tour of the facility, a very close interpretive tour of the launch facility, all the rocket, Saturn V-B rocket was assembled and then taken out to the launch pad. We also went down to Patrick Air Force Base, where I met a very competent U.S. Air Force nurse, and she was in charge of putting together all the instruments and things that we would need for the mission that we were being assigned to. She wrapped them up in surgical linen and sterilized them, then hermetically sealed them and put them into what was called a Connex box. Container exchange, I think, is what it stood for. And this was full of surgical instruments that was going to be put aboard the carrier when we got to it there in Hawaii. So we were briefed on the mission, told what to expect. An Air Force flight surgeon was working with them there, and he gave us a good briefing on the type of injuries that they might have and the facilities, including the Connex box that we would have on the Yorktown. I, of course, had been on carriers before. I knew what the sick bay was like on a carrier, so that was nothing novel to me. Then we went home, and 2 weeks later we're out in Hawaii and getting on board the USS Yorktown and loading up and getting ready to go out into the ocean and meet them when they came down. Our mission was there in case they were injured. And I suspect you're probably interested in the type of injuries we could have expected. But you know, they're coming down from the sky on a recovery vehicle, which is their command module, with 3 parachutes and retro rockets, and coming down with a high velocity into the atmosphere, and they look like a comet when they're coming through with the burn. And I don't know if you've taken pictures of the heat shield on the base of our Apollo 9 module that we have here, but it just turns solid black, and it's like the tiles on the space shuttle. They prevent the heat from getting to the interior of the capsule. Well, they have 3 parachutes, and if the parachutes didn't work, or if 1 or 2 of them failed, they could come down pretty hard and land in the ocean at tremendous speed. And even though their couches in the shuttle are designed to compress and absorb a lot of that shock, But that's with all three parachutes working and normal gravity going. But if you had a failed parachute, you never know which way they would come down. They might come down sideways. But we expected that our injuries would include broken back, fractured livers, fractured spleen, head injuries. Didn't know what to expect beyond that, but beyond those, I would expect them to be minor, relatively so. Well, we got out there and watched them come down out of the sky. And it was a beautiful sight. They landed in the water very near the ship, and everything worked perfectly. So we were just tourists and didn't have to do any surgery on them. We got to meet them. They're charming gentlemen, having just come back from going around the moon. They were excited. They were just pumped up, as you might expect. I helped get Frank Borman out of his flight suit. He and I talked about some of the things about the reentry that I noticed, and he commented and said they weren't going to do that again because they thought they might burn the shroud lines. 40 years later, they were all here for their 40th reunion. Neil Armstrong came and was the keynote speaker, and I was aside one corner with Frank Borman. He remembered our conversation and got his wife and introduced her, and he was a charming gentleman, even at the 40 years later. Other than that, I was ready to do trauma surgery like I'd done in Vietnam when I was out there a number of years earlier as a surgeon. Did you have any specific questions that maybe I could answer for you?
Well, the goal of this particular interview is just for me to get a sense of what you know and what knowledge you can contribute to the documentary. So I just like this interview to be very low pressure and for you just
Sure.
to talk about honestly whatever you'd like as relating to space program or really anything you feel as well.
Well, that was basically the mission. I did the same thing for Apollo 11, which was the first moon landing. Neil Armstrong, of course, led that team with his foot on the moon that everybody heard him say, one small step for man. When they returned, they again made a perfect entry and didn't require any surgery. They went into the Airstream trailer for isolation, though, because they didn't know what biologicals they may have picked up on the moon. So they went in there for 21 days until they were satisfied that the quarantine was no longer necessary. They did that for 3 missions where they actually did moon landings. The NASA flight surgeon who was there, checking blood pressure and heart rate and that sort of thing, went into the trailer, and then he had to stay there for the full 21 days because he became contaminated by his entry. I was able to go through the trailer before the actual mission took place so that I got some photographs of it and saw what their bunks were like, their eating facilities. They had the test equipment there for checking basic metabolic rate and X-rays, just as they had on the sick bay of the Yorktown, but this was inside the trailer. The Airstream trailer went off the ship when we got to Pearl Harbor and was flatbedded over to a big C-5A Galaxy and then sent back to Houston. That's where they finished out their isolation. It was a very, very well thought out, well done system as I viewed it from my very focused position with the medical part of the Apollo. Of interest is the fact that at the Cape, they had a medical facility there, which consisted, it was a low building, had about 3 big rooms in it, and there was what then passed for an intensive care unit in case they had to abort the mission at the Cape and then come down hard. Again, injuries, which they would take care of there, but they had the ICU all set for them. I would say a little bit primitive by today's standards, but it would have done the job had it been necessary. I do have a coin that I'll share with you if you'd like to hold it in your hand, because they gave us that after the Apollo 8 mission.
Yeah.
And basically what it says is this is the first lunar Apollo flight, and Borman, Lovell, and Anders brought metal back, or they brought metal from their Apollo 8, and those coins were manufactured from it. But the metal you're holding has been around the moon.
Really? It's remarkably light.
It's an aluminum alloy. It may have some magnesium in it, but it is light. People say I should, keep that in a safe deposit box, but I keep it here at the museum in my pocket so I can show it to people and share the fun I had being part of the Apollo thing. Of course, it was a little nerve-wracking ahead of time. Can you imagine if they had been injured? This is Walter Cronkite, sick bay of USS Yorktown, where Dr. Jorgensen's about to take out Frank Borman's spleen. Doctor? So, never had to go through that little interview on the Yorktown.
So, are there any experiences or interactions you had with any astronauts that stand out to you?
Well, the best was that with Frank Borman, because he was such a gentleman. I was introduced to Jim Lovell, he of Apollo 13, the one they made the movie about, this crazy Air Force flight surgeon who was coming with them on the ship, introduced me as ComDom Pack, and Jim Lovell wanted to know what the hell was ComDom Pack, and I had never heard of it either, and this Air Force flight surgeon said, "That's commanding officer, dirty old man, Pacific." So there was lightheartedness among all the tense moments that led up to their coming down for that recovery. It was a privilege to have been part of that.
So, how did you first get involved with sort of being a surgeon? So I know you worked in.
Well, I went to medical school at UCLA after I did my undergraduate work at San Diego State. After some ordinary sea duty as a general medical officer, I went to Bethesda at the Navy Hospital there in Maryland, outside Washington, and did my surgical training there. From there, I went straight to Vietnam for a year as a surgeon, and then came back to San Diego and went to the Navy Hospital. And that's when my boss picked me out of the lineup and said, "You're going to go to the Cape to learn how to be an astronaut, doctor."
So do you think you could sort of narrate the sort of physical challenges and astronaut experiences in spaceflight, sort of the
Well,
just one more thing before we begin. I've got this bottle of water in case you.
oh,
in case you,
okay,
just
thank you,
there.
thank you. They were concerned, of course, and that's even more so in the shuttle program, where they're up in space and the International Space Station, where they're up in space for a much longer period. Concern about the effect of weightlessness, the loss of calcium from the bones, the degradation of the muscles because you're not exercising against any real hard effort. If you did this to a chair, the chair would just keep going, because of the weightlessness of everything up there. For the Apollo that we were able to determine, talking with the NASA flight surgeon and all that, the X-rays didn't show any bone density changes. The muscles, they weighed the same when they came back. Within reasonable amounts, nothing of a significant loss. I do know that vertigo is a problem. They sometimes get dizzy because of the weightlessness. And that's not an uncommon thing, even flat on Mother Earth, for people to develop vertigo, especially in later years. They do exercise with machines on the space station. They have to tie it down and tie yourself down so that you can do it. They have to use weights that you work against because anything else is just not going to give you the resistance that you would get in an ordinary exercise program here on the Earth. Diet, of course, is a different feature. They try to do the best they can to make the diets as reasonable and not go into the psychiatric problems of a yucky meal. You can imagine how the same old stuff, cornflakes in a bag, would taste or would be on your attitude and everything like that. I think would change, but they spend a lot of time working on the psychological aspects of being up there all that time too. They have communication ability, so you're not that far from home at any time. It's almost like the old 2001 Space Odyssey, where the fellow was able to talk to the child on his birthday or the family on his birthday. So all that's pretty well thought through.
Do you think you could go more into detail about the sort of daily routine of an astronaut and how they conduct their lives might be different to when they're on Earth as opposed to being
So you're talking about in the capsule up in space going around?
yeah, sort
Okay.
of.
Well, they've got a lot of things to do. Mission Control keeps them busy. There's various experiments and testing of their mental stability at any given time. They want to know, just ask them questions and things like that and get appropriate answers. The biggest question we get down here, of course, at the museum is how on earth do they go to the bathroom? And that's a serious problem. We had a lecture by a fellow here who worked for NASA, and he called himself Dr. Flush. And he spent a lot of time working on that issue. Urine control, to be blunt, there are different ways. A catheter, an indwelling catheter in a leg bag was one thing that was tried. They didn't like that. You can't blame them. A thing was called a Texas catheter, which was a condom on the outside with a tube coming out of it. That was less controversial, or less formidable, so to speak. Old Flush, he had various tube designs that would have a low-grade suction on them so that you could use that and it would be cast over the side. You may remember that in one of the very early, I think it was a Mercury one, where they saw bright objects flying by in the sky, and what it was frozen droplets of urine that had been cast out of the space capsule. So solid material, that's a different problem. They tried things like depends in the buddy system, and all that was saved on the Apollo so that could be analyzed and see what they were losing with it. But that was probably one of the biggest challenges, is human waste, but they worked it out. So much more room on the International Space Station that it's less of a problem. They've got room there to deal with it in a more humane way, so to speak.
Could you comment on the sort of training astronauts have to go through, and the sort of testing that they need to undergo before they can?
Well, the museum is going to set up a whole new exhibit on that very subject. I don't know if you saw them working out there in the first gallery where Da Vinci was, but from start to finish, it's pretty complex. First off, physical characteristics. You can't be too short, you can't be too tall. I think the height limit was early on 5'11", but they finally pushed it up to about 6'2". But don't hold me to those numbers, because it really wasn't my business to worry about how tall they were. Weight was again a limit. You had to fit inside these capsules, especially the Mercury, the first 7 spaceships that went up with a single pilot, single astronaut. But then they had to be reasonably educated. Most of them have been aviators, at least early on in the program. Uh, the ones where they had to really fly them, excuse me, was where they kind of focused on pilots. Later on, when they had a crew, then they didn't have to be a pilot because you had a pilot crew that was servicing the vehicle. Engineering, of course, was the keynote. Engineering seemed to the whole STEM thing, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. It's all just a part of it. And so they followed along, psychological testing. Can you deal with claustrophobia? Because they're confined in a relatively small space for a long time. Are you of the sort of personality that you get along with people? You can't have somebody who's a 4+ jerk being there in a situation like that. But I have to say, to me, my relationship with it was purely the if in doubt, cut it out kind of a thing as a surgeon, and we didn't get into the psychiatric or sociologic problems. But it was tested. It was really cleared before they would let these people go up there.
Well, are there any other sort of experiences that stand out?
Well, let's see. Of course, you know, the return of these astronauts was the peak, you know, of a long flat valley, being out there in the ocean waiting for them to come, and it was over in a matter of minutes or hours, depending upon how long it took them to be recovered by the helicopter crew and get them in. It was rewarding, as short as it was. But other than going to the Cape, being part of it there, you know, was being briefed, seeing the whole works in action. There wasn't much else we did. We got home, we went right back to work down at Balboa because I had no long-term relationship with NASA.
Okay. Um, I don't have any specific questions at this point.
Okay, well, I understand, and I hope I'm telling you what you need to know, trying to feed you a whole lot of experience, you know, in a short time. But I just want to say that my experience with the astronauts that I saw and talked with, the ones I've met here over the years, because there have been a lot of them have come here. I don't see Apollo 13, the movie, without remembering Jim Lovell, and he shows up at the end of the movie in a cameo appearance. I don't know if you knew that. He comes up and salutes Tom Hanks on the aircraft carrier. But otherwise, I've not been a Houston person. I've never been to Houston. Don't know what it's like there, but I've been to the Cape 5 times, if you count the time I took my wife there to show her off.
To you, what does being an astronaut mean? What does it entail?
Well, astro, of course, means stars, space. That's astrology, you know, astronomy. That's the root of the word. Naut is used to be a aquanaut, nautical, ocean, but then the space of the ocean, the space of space is the ocean of the universe, so to speak. So they were going out into the unknown, just as the sailors used to do when the maps used to say, beyond here there be dragons. Once you got on that rocket and you were pushed up into the orbit there, you were waiting for the dragons to show up because they didn't really know what it was going to be like all through that whole time. And so they were very heroic people, all of them. And I admire them for that. They're always very willing to share their thoughts and experiences with us if we're not just being silly, you know what I mean? If we have serious questions, they're ready to teach, that's part of our job here too. And I've always appreciated that.
All right. Well, at this point, is there any last stories you'd like to tell, pieces of information you'd like to
Well, after I retired from the Navy and I retired from private practice, it became a case of finding something to do. And with my experiences, my own personal experiences with aviation, which was always with my dad or with a partner. I never was a pilot as such, but came down here and kind of brought it all together. The airplane that I had my first flight in, the type is hanging right outside the door there. The astronaut shuttle, Apollo 9, that came down, command module, Apollo 9, was sort of the other end of the long spectrum of my parallel career with aviation. My parents came here to San Diego during the war. Dad to build bombers and Mom to build flying boats. I was a latchkey kid with my sister up in Linda Vista. But it all has come together here at this delightful museum where I get to work as a volunteer. And as I say earlier, teaching is a big part of it. And so every encounter I have with someone, it's a teaching experience, and very often I learn things as well that I didn't know before.
So, what would you say to someone who's 10 years old and wanted to be an astronaut? What sort of advice would you give to them?
Well, a lot of people put a lot of effort into that, and they call it the STEM program. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Of course, at age 10, that's pretty basic, but the mathematics is certainly there, and the ability to think not just intuitively, but logically. That's something that if you don't think logically, if you jump to conclusions, you don't get to the root analysis of what you're trying to do. So at 10, enjoy being a 10-year-old, but stay with school and follow it up. Stay healthy. Don't smoke. Typical doctor, that's me. But as you get older, education becomes more and more important. Get into high school, why then they're very well able to keep you up with these STEM projects. And then for your education, it's what interests you the most. But in those fields, I think that's what, if you want to be an astronaut type. I wouldn't. Wonderful to be a musician. I was a musician of sorts, but that was always a sidebar.
All right. Well, unless there's any last comments, I think we're just about finished.
Well, you pretty much exhausted me.
All right.
I'm seldom at a loss for words, Ben, but you did a good job.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you'll edit that out nicely and all that. And good luck with your program. I think that's kind of fun. Are you doing any more interviews here?
I don't believe any more today, no.
Yeah, well, sometime in the future, maybe, yeah.
Yes.
Well, the fellow that was there before me, I'm sure he had more sophisticated information for you
Yes.
than I did, yeah.
He had a lot to share.
Yeah, yeah, well, as I say, I'm just an old rupture mechanic, and basically what I do, you know, or I did. Don't do it anymore.
Well, thank you for
Okay,
sharing.
well, thank you. I will take that water if I may.
Oh, it's fine.
Good. Yeah. Dry it out a little bit.
If you wouldn't mind if I could.
Oh, yes, yeah, there you go. I forgot about that.
Thank you.